as estrogen tends to climb up as well, we also get this confounding effect, or compounding effect, should I say, where as estradiol increases within this menopausal phase, it can actually suppress the formation of thyroid hormone. So you can get a double whammy effect of the ovaries failing, not producing enough progesterone.
I'm Kitty Blentfield, co-founder of New Strength and Saturée, creator of pro-metabolic food supplements and seriously saturated skincare. And today I am joined by Tomo Littlewood. Keith is his name, but we call him Tomo. He's been on the podcast heaps. He's a POM. He's actually back in the UK. He did live in Dubai for a while. He's got his master's in endocrinology and is now doing his PhD. Welcome.
Morning. Morning.
He's still a bit asleep. He's drinking his coffee at 7 a.m. in the bloody UK. And it's probably freezing and it's muggy as here in Australia. So yeah, today I wanted to get him to talk about perimenopause and menopause and some of the misconceptions around them. And that it's lack of estrogen and what is causing a lot of the symptoms, and then we'll talk about some of the things that you can do and that we do with women in our program to improve those symptoms and then help them lose weight and get the body that they want. So maybe Keith or Tomo, sorry, first talk about how do you define perimenopause and then what is menopause?
Well, perimenopause is obviously the build up towards menopause, where menopause ultimately becomes the failure of the ovaries to secrete the steroidal hormones or to gradually stop producing them. Obviously, we have the main hormones that people tend to talk about, which are estrogen, the other estrogens like estrone and estriol. But most importantly, I think, is obviously the lack of production of progesterone. And perimenopause is that kind of it's that phase before where women will start to notice perhaps some of those kind of symptoms starting to creep in. Now, the symptoms, although are well defined, the description or the mechanisms of what might happen tend to be a little bit erroneous depending on what kind of research you're looking at. You and I are both very aware of the fact that progesterone is this wonderful kind of steroidal hormone that we've seen do many, many wonderful things. But in the classic literature, one of the main processes that's described is the loss of estrogen. Now, it's when we consider the fact that estrogen can be produced by many, many tissues. If you even hold on to any small amount of adipose tissue, you're more inclined to produce the enzyme aromatase. And one thing that's been found, the difference between perimenopausal and menopausal women, is that they start to often produce more aromatase. Now, as estrogen tends to climb up as well, we also get this confounding effect, or compounding effect, should I say, where as estradiol increases within this menopausal phase, it can actually suppress the formation of the thyroid hormone. So you can get a double whammy effect of the ovaries failing, not producing enough progesterone. And bearing in mind that progesterone is actually, it's really the protective hormone that females have. There's a reason it's produced in large amounts during the first trimester and second trimester, and tends to wane off towards the third trimester. It's because it has many, many qualities that allow the fetus to survive by living in an oxygen-rich environment, promoting adequate blood sugar levels. Now, getting away from pregnancy, bring it back towards menopause. Now, as these hormones start to decline, and particularly progesterone, we can start to see many of these negative changes, which might be related to mood. It might be related to kind of sleep. It might be related to hair loss. It might be related to sometimes increasing in weight gain, and that can be multifactorial, as we know. But it's really the idea that as the ovaries start to fail, you're losing production of this very, very protective hormone, particularly progesterone, which tends to have cardioprotective effects. It also has kind of bone trophic effects, so its capacity to help build bone, whereas estrogen is considered, it helps to prevent more bone resorption. But when it's being used in certain studies, there are again some confounding effects that have been used to perhaps conflate the effects of estrogen. Often women who are taking estrogen within an HRT are often then prescribed calcium supplements as an example, or given dietary advice that might modulate that effect. So I think it's really important to consider and know what are the hormones, or what is the key hormones that or hormone that's being lost that can be ultimately protected against to negate these negative effects that a lot of women go through. Some don't do. You probably come across the odd female that said, "I didn't notice any changes during menopause," and some women will be going, "Oh my God, you're so lucky. That wasn't my case," you know. And even women who are put on HRT, you often find some very negative anecdotal data from clients that I've come across who just said it drove me insane, or you know, and there are again very different reactions about why this happened. Again, as estrogen tends to increase, estrogen tends to promote an increase in nitric oxide. Now, everybody thinks nitric oxide is a wonderful molecule. There are various forms of it. I think there are 4 forms of nitric oxide. But as you kind of get an increase in estrogen, you know, these hot flushes that are being experienced can be multifactorial. It can come from an increase in nitric oxide. It can come from an increase in adrenal activation, because what the adrenal glands can do is produce more progesterone. And you can imagine if the adrenals are being asked to kind of increase their output of steroidal hormones, that, you know, that you can get kind of adrenaline type flushes that can happen as well.
And so can you talk a bit, Keith? So I think, you know, like in some of the books that I've read, I can't remember the guy's name. It was What Your Doctor Hasn't Told You About Menopause. But that's it. Yeah, he talks about how in non-Western countries, you know, women typically don't experience these minimal perimenopausal and menopausal symptoms, but in the Western countries where we're, you know, undernourished, we're very stressed, where some are over exercising, too much alcohol, you know, hormonal birth control, emotional stress, you know, bloody social media, you know, we seem to be experiencing so many of these symptoms. So can you talk about, you know, like when I talk to women, I try to describe it like it's just a sign that your body's stressed. This is why you're experiencing symptoms. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, and there's some parallel. So I don't know if you know the Weston A. Price book, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. He talked about that often women, you know, tribal women or kind of, you know, societies that was far removed from Western culture didn't experience PMS or go through any kind of menstrual disorders. I don't think that's particularly true, because you could go to Africa where there were low iodine states, for example, and low thyroid function, who would have experienced substantial kind of you know, menstrual disorders. So I don't think we can take that as a kind of blanket statement. I think with regarding the idea of stress, and stress becomes, there are many components that can converge on stress. I think that there's emotional stress, there's chemical stress, there's physical stress. I think we can't underestimate, and this is kind of where my research is looking at, is the effect of chemical stresses, particularly in westernized environments. I'm going to use Australia as an example. I was looking at some research where they suggested that the uptake of breathing in and ingesting brominated flame retardants was perhaps up to about anywhere between 7,000 and 17,000 milligrams of dust that contained these flame retardants. So if you can think about that, you end up not just breathing in and consuming these, and equally younger kids who perhaps, and even mums who are going to say like soft play areas. These soft play areas, the chemicals that are in these things. Now, what I don't want to do is scare people. Don't go to soft play. It's to understand that when we were being told about what's driving the disease processes, whether it's polycystic ovary syndrome, whether it's menstrual disorders, anovulation, amenorrhea, all of these things, there are multiple factors that are converging that are going to disrupt your hormones. And to the extent your hormones have been disrupted, will increase the likelihood of you having a very negative experience when it comes to perimenopause and menopause. So those particular stresses can't be, and we don't think about those things. You know, they're relatively invisible. Whether stuff is in our food, whether it's in the air, and the air is a huge source of kind of endocrine and hormone disrupting chemicals. So that's one particular stress. Obviously, it becomes slightly cyclical as well. So if you're kind of building up for, you know, your menstrual cycle, and you're experiencing rabid kind of premenstrual syndrome, that can be obviously an increase in estrogen that drives that response, and you might start to notice more hair fall, more insomnia, more irritability, more changes to your mood, swelling, edema, as your kind of cells tend to hold on to more water. And that can be, you know, part of the cycle that doesn't get broken, because one, you might not eat as much food, you might try and over-exercise, and we know that, you know, over-exercising in that kind of onset of the follicular phase is associated with increased injury, because you tend to produce more estrogen in that phase, and that the estrogen receptors are abundant, and they're often increased when increased estrogen is produced. It can be happening when they're not being produced as well, though. But the concept of stress becomes there are so many factors with it. And often during this phase as well, is that thyroid tends to be suppressed. Some women go into a relatively transient state of low thyroid function because estrogen is quite high. So whether it becomes this chemical stressor, whether it becomes emotional stressor, which will feed back into the chemicals that we produce and the hormones that we regulate, and then the forms of physical stress, whether it's being physically abused, as an example. And I use that as an end range example, but some women do go through that. Some men go through that. I mean, it's a common problem, but the physical stress tends to more manifest itself in the type of exercise that some women might do. So they might exercise themselves into the ground, try and exercise 5 and 6 days a week because they really don't like the idea of gaining any weight, and they use that kind of suppressive kind of component of under eating and over exercising. But we know that can have some very deleterious effects on how many hormones you produce. So again, this kind of all of these stresses converge, these chemical, these emotional, and these physical stresses, to create problems. And sometimes you can't see the wood for the trees, right? You don't know where to go with it. And I think when we kind of dial back, even getting that foundational approach of getting the nutrition and the exercise right is the first step before we even kind of perhaps consider looking at, supplemental hormones or, extra supplements that we might need. Is kind of just understanding what our energy requirements are, what our sleep requirements are, what our poop requirements are, all of these things.
Can you talk a bit more about like HRT, and would you, recommend women take synthetic estrogen or progestins, or, can you talk a bit more about HRT?
Sure. Obviously, I'm not a doctor. I can't diagnose, and I can't kind of undermine or suggest that they should go again what their doctors are suggesting. But I would encourage them to look at the broad amount of research that's beyond the scope of a Google search or what the doctor directly recommends. There are plenty of resources that you need to go and look at, whether it's books or research papers. The problem is with HRT is some of the synthetic hormones that are used tend to become very problematic. Even if we think about supplementing with what we consider to be the protective hormone progesterone, it's often a synthetic progesterone that's used. Synthetic progesterones do not operate like natural progesterones on multiple levels. And I've seen this time and time again. So my advice would be to source out and understand why natural progesterone is a much more efficient form of regulating hormones during the menopausal phase and postmenopausal phase. And I've seen this with countless clients that I've worked with. Synthetic progestins, or progestins are synthetic progesterone, can actually almost have an estrogen-like effect. And again, when it comes to looking at the studies, don't be misled by the fact that they've used the word progesterone, because a lot of doctors and research will, just throw the idea in that the idea of a progesterone is also a synthetic progestin as well. And when you see some of the effects of this, some studies have described the effects of, why estrogen was linked with higher rates of breast cancer, an example, but then they kind of tried to use synthetic progesterone and sometimes found that was worse in some cases, depending on the study that you looked at. But if you think about what the progesterone is there for, it's ultimately there to counter the effects of estrogen. It's an anti-estrogen. It prevents the negative effects like fibrosis, which often occurs in breast cancer. In polycystic ovary syndrome, it could be the effects of low progesterone, high estrogen, high aromatase, also converting to testosterone, but ultimately low thyroid that drives these states. So if you do take more estrogen, and there's plenty of research out there that shows that it will suppress the formation of thyroid hormone, it will stop the conversion to T4 and T3, ultimately conversion and also the production at the thyroid gland itself. Estrogen is intimately related with fibrosis. So is the hormone, the thyroid stimulating hormone, which is produced by the pituitary to ramp up the production of thyroid hormone. Now, there are some studies, more observational studies, that associate the idea of high estrogen levels with kind of relationships between nodules within the thyroid, and also kind of fibroid type diseases within the reproductive tract, like the ovaries, endometriosis. So there is plenty of research that highlights the effects of increasing estrogens, and estrogen has some very disruptive effects on metabolism when it's in excess. Not to say, I think it's really important here to say that don't be, just because we're using the word that estrogen is kind of has very problematic. In excess, it's very problematic. Estrogen's a natural hormone that we need plenty of. It's instrumental in kind of, rebuilding tissue, particularly if, let's say, if you've been injured, you cut yourself. Estrogen is part of that prolific response. But when you bring that back to, say, the menstrual cycle, the excess of estrogen and the excess of chemicals within the environment that act like estrogens will stimulate more tissue production because they act like estrogens and they promote proliferation and growth of tissues. So this growth, whether it's in the reproductive tissue, whether it's in the breast, whether it's formation of thyroid nodules, which is only associational and observational at the moment, it's not totally proven, but there's a substantial body of research that suggests that way. And we know that an excess of estrogen is implicating cancer. Is that something you need to be mindful of? Is the estrogen pushing you towards metabolic dysfunction? Is it pushing you towards disrupting your thyroid by suppressing thyroid to produce more metabolic dysfunction? Is it lending itself to fibrosis? Is it playing havoc with your kind of mood and what you're experiencing? It's a bit like when a lot of women were put on birth control pills. One of the most common things I've heard from a female put on birth control pills is, I thought I was going mad. Now, if you think about going on HRT, for a lot of females, it's on the back of, sometimes decades of taking some form of oral contraceptive as well. So you get this double whammy where you've been saturating your tissues, and estrogen can accumulate in cells. That's why looking at estrogen within a blood test isn't a particularly reliable way of ascertaining it. You can look at things like Dutch test and other tests like that as an example, but the symptoms that you can see from an excess of estrogen can often be very on the surface and visible and superficial, but just by looking at some people. So it's trying to understand is whether you need that estrogen or not. Do you need progesterone to counteract that? And some women do have actually, I've seen clients who have said, taking estrogen was a game changer for them. They are in the they're in the minority. It's not something I've seen a lot of. But the amount of females that I've seen who've just gone on to a progesterone and who've kind of use some nutritional supplements to help kind of lower the effects of excess estrogen to support metabolism. These are the clients I tend to see the majority of. So it's just understanding of, well, HRT, where it's taking you, because sometimes you can see HRT cause some very negative symptoms that just don't pan out to be that protective.
And can you talk about blood tests? Like, often women will get blood tests for estrogen and say, oh, my estrogen's really low.
Yeah, so the typical test, the estradiol test, which you can get, which is the standard blood test like many other blood tests, it can be problematic because, as I said, a lot of hormones are bounded within the cell. Some of the largest reserves, I'm going to talk about thyroid hormone, the largest reserves of thyroid hormone are within the cell. And sometimes it's not totally representative within the blood of what the actual values are. We tend to think of blood tests as this gold standard that everybody kind of, makes their diagnosis on if you're a medical doctor. But it's never representative in the cell. And that's the same thing with estradiol as well, is that you don't know how much estrogen is sitting within the cell. Estrogen, when it sits in the cell, it makes the cell very excitable. It can promote the transfer of calcium from outside the cell to inside the cell. So you get this large excitability. It can also promote the uptake of water. So, women within that menstrual cycle, and perhaps even postmenopausal, who are prone to edema and swelling, this is estrogen's effects. So perhaps looking at more symptoms rather than the blood test can be useful for many people. It becomes inherently hard to make that suggestion. And the thyroid blood test is a complete it's a good example because there are so many pathways of disruption within the brain, within the thyroid gland, within the blood transport proteins, and the same with, you can see issues with sex hormone binding globulin with estrogen as well. So there are other tests that you can look at to get an idea there. But also within the cell as well, there are very different mechanisms where estrogen can be held in the cell. It can bind to its receptor and cause these effects of kind of estrogen excess, which we've talked about. So it becomes, I think, really important to look at the symptoms that someone's experiencing rather than being told. And, when it's been related to perhaps things like thyroid before, how many people have kind of felt they have a thyroid issue, but the doctor's just told them it's all in their head because their blood test appears completely normal. And if you kind of deconstruct, say, something like the TSH and the thyroid blood test, you can apply that thinking to also estradiol and estrogen tests as well.
Cool. All right, let's talk about what some things that you can do. I think looking at the nutrition, making sure you're eating adequate calories, I think, and getting adequate protein. A lot of women they'll either undereat consistently, or they undereat and they binge eat. Polyunsaturated fats, a lot of seed oils. Maybe can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, the seed oils and the vegetable oils is quite an interesting point, because they can have the very similar effects to what estrogen can do to thyroid carrying proteins within the blood. So they can actually hijack these carrier proteins, and particularly in the brain as well. So they can kick T4 off, which is this kind of thyroid hormone that converts to T3. They both have very clear effects. T4 is often described as this kind of like the pre-hormone, whereas T3 is the kind of active one. That's not really true, because they both have very useful actions. But the capacity of estrogen and polyunsaturated fats, also an excess of saturated fats, can kick off. So if you're eating a really, really high fat diet, the effect tends to be the same, but it's more easily achieved with the polyunsaturated fats. So these fats not only can bind to the thyroid carrier proteins within the blood, they can destabilize the mitochondria. And if you get a double whammy of high estrogen with high polyunsaturated fats within the cell, it causes kind of very broad scale metabolic dysfunction, which can lead to damage to the cells and ultimately damage to the DNA. And perhaps this can be implicated in pathways to tumor formation. So it's really important to understand that limiting these fats, one of the key reasons is that they also promote lipid peroxidation. So this damage to the cell is mediated in part by lowering the defenses like vitamin E, vitamin C, glutathione. All of these things can be damaged by an increase in polyunsaturated fats. So I always think being mindful of looking at, I mean, there's some food chains out here, like Waitrose and Marks and Spencers. They used to be relatively devoid of rapeseed oil and sunflower oils. And literally all of their foods have these fats in. So looking at the labels, I think, is very key, and making sure that your fat content isn't excessive by any means. Now, to the extent that these fats can cause damage, they're also going to limit, or they're going to induce some amount of damage to how you utilize your carbohydrates if it's chronic enough and it's problematic enough. So if you've got this issue of you're damaging your cells, you're not able to regulate your carbohydrate efficiently, you then kind of start to have issues related to around carbohydrate metabolism, right? You might get high glucose, as an example, or hyperglycemia. So these can need to be considered within the context of how we use our carbohydrate. Getting an adequate carbohydrate in, again, is an essential component. We all know that the key to, despite what's out in the Twitter sphere or in the nutrition sphere about how keto and carnivore is saving the world, I've had enough people who've been doing that long enough whose hair's been falling out, they've been constipated, can't sleep, and all the other things. They tend to look in this kind of dogma of a very short space of time that when you change any particular diet and you've gone from, say, even if it's meat eating to veganism, even if it's gone to high carb to low carb, when you change something in the short term, if you've been doing something not as well as you could be, you're going to notice some positive effects, right? So it's always about taking that within that temporal phase of how well that's working for you, and does it pan out long term. Bring us back to the point about getting enough energy in. I think we all need adequate protein in. We also need adequate carbohydrate in. We also need adequate fats, but probably less so. And our body will still make a certain amount of will still efficiently make steroidal hormones despite kind of lower levels of fat sometimes. But sometimes we need to bring it back to, it becomes very nuanced and subjective to what each person needs.
Okay, cool. So reduce or limit the vegetable oils, eat adequate calories. Carrot salad. Talk about the carrot salad and how that can be beneficial, the raw carrot salad.
Yeah, some people I've always seen on certain social media things go, oh, your carrot salad doesn't lower estrogen. What carrot salad does, and Ray Peat's original ideas were, it's a poorly digested starch that will take endotoxin, a lower bacterial load out of the bowel. In essence, what that does, I mean, you do get fecal excretion of steroidal hormones. You get a large amount in the urine, but you also get a certain amount within the bowel. So it can basically bind any of the hydroxylated estrogens that can be removed from the bowel. But ultimately, its biggest impact is it binds endotoxin and excess bacteria, which have an anti-metabolic effect. Just like, I mean, endotoxin is one of the kind of nastiest things around, and if you get too much in it, you'll go into sepsis. You know, if you've had any kind of damage done to your body will, and tissues being broken down at an exponential rate. You tend to see this increase in endotoxin and lipopolysaccharide. Now, within your diet, if you're eating lots of foods that are poorly digested, perhaps they promote more bacterial production of certain types of bacteria, even being high in things like lactobacillus, for example. If you're eating lots of these foods that have these that are relatively fermented, that can increase the amount of delactate and have this kind of anti-metabolic effect. So what carrot salad does, it effectively binds these things that inhibit the metabolism of the bowel. And the metabolism of the bowel is just as important as metabolism of the heart or metabolism of the kidneys. It needs to maintain optimal energy and optimal metabolism. And when it's exposed to too much endotoxin, too much unsaturated fatty acids, it can become damaged, it become leaky, it can promote the tight junctions. Now, in your gut, you have, these are the tight junctions with the villi, the microvilli that tend to function. These can get damaged, and also the tight junctions can actually become more permeable and open up your bowel to absorbing more anything that's problematic. You know, in lots of our foods, there tends to be, lots of endocrine disruptors in plenty of foods, and if we're kind of consuming these, or plastics that can be getting into food, these can go into the bloodstream relatively easy when the bowel becomes damaged. And so the carrot salad, there's quite a few studies now that show that consumption of raw grated carrot has some very, very beneficial effects. Even it can lower excess cholesterol, which is often excreted out through bile and into the digestive tract, or into the intestinal tract as well. So in the end, what it ultimately does is lowers all of these compounds that are relatively nasty, that damage the bowel, that dysregulate the function of the bowel. And I think even when it comes to kind of regulating hormones like thyroid function, as an example, and absorption. And how we regulate kind of other hormones, having your bowel in an optimal manner, where you're going to toilet I think at least twice a day is a normal bowel movement scenario. Then you're getting rid of the stuff that shouldn't be there. You're not as full as crap of it anymore as you were. And that's, I think, just having that ability to go to poop twice a day is a great way of being able to regulate hormones by lowering these anti-metabolic substances.
And now, what about liver? Eating some fresh liver, or liver supplements, or liver capsules?
Yeah,
about liver.
I mean, they all have their place. I think obviously that fresh liver is the best bang for the buck. Some clients I have that just don't like eating fresh. It's a very female thing. Mostly, a lot more females do not like eating organ meats. But if that's not appropriate, then I think the supplements have a great place. I do think retinol is something that can be overconsumed, and I think there's some seasonal nuance to it. So, for example, people often need more in the summertime when they're exposed to UV lights, and I can say often a lot more. I'm talking, tens of thousands of units of retinol. When you're sick, one of the well-known mechanisms of when you get ill is that you deplete vitamin A, particularly retinol. Now, retinol is this kind of nutrient that has also very similar receptor, it's almost exactly the same receptor, nuclear receptor, the same as thyroid hormone. So thyroid hormone and thyroid receptors tend to kind of bind together with retinoid X receptors. And so it's important to consider how important vitamin A and retinol is, because it has a very kind of hormonal kind of interaction with thyroid. And again, it's easily depleted when you're in sunshine or when you're sick. So making sure that you have adequate amounts. It can be quite easy to get too much depending on the person. If your energy is low, if your thyroid's low, if you're consuming also a lot of beta carotenoids, so you like your squashes, even carrot salads can be problematic to someone if you're prone to getting excess excess carotenoids, and even washing your carrot salad can help to limit that by washing away. If you've ever put a grated carrot salad in water, you'll see all this kind of carotenoids come out. Now that can overwhelm the liver, so an excess of retinol and an excess of carotenoids can show up in our hands and feet with these fat pads that we have, and if they're getting orangey, that's a good sign you're getting too much of the carotenoids. I think, as a general rule, a piece of liver once a week is a really good metric to have for most people, and you'll hit a lot. And again, if you can't have that, switch to some of the supplements. You can often see some things related to skin come out, particularly in the summer. One of the things that I noticed, I used to get cold sores all the time if I was in the sun all the time, particularly on my nose just here. Since I've been eating liver, I just don't get them anymore. Even when I'm sick, I rarely get an outburst of a cold sore. Yeah. So one of the key functions of liver is retinol, and that's a differentiating. It's a bit like thyroid. It helps tissues to understand how they're supposed to grow, to help once estrogen has done its proliferation job. Tissues need to have some organization of what they're growing into, and that's what retinol is. It's a differentiating nutrient. So cold sores, for example, I've seen it work well with other kind of skin things. When your skin starts to split, there's dry cracks on your feet as well. Often a good sign that you're not getting enough retinol in. Hormone conversion, vitamin A is very, very useful for. So it has some very, very beneficial effects that are paralleled with thyroid hormone. There's some people who are out there kind of saying that, retinols, you don't need any of it. And, there's a practitioner who's very vocal about it. I won't mention his name because he's a bit of an arse. But I don't think he understands the ideas that when you're low thyroid function, your ability to regulate retinol is substantially challenged. So, and if you're living in a country where hypothyroidism is increasing due to these chemical processes, you can have a real hard time regulating liver function, ability to use vitamin A, particularly retinol as well. And if you've got a double whammy of low thyroid function and you're consuming too many carotenoids, not getting enough energy, and then it's a recipe for disaster, and you can consume too much. But again, there's nuance with everything. I mean, to say that retinol and vitamin A is bad and toxic is, I think, completely problematic. It's like anything, estrogen is necessary in the right dose. Estrogen can become toxic very quickly when there's too much of it, and there's a convergence with estrogen mimicking chemicals from the environment.
Okay, great. So I think with 100 grams of liver a week, or you can take the Saturée liver capsules. That's what I do. I say to women, just make pate, just get it in. It's amazing. Limiting endocrine disruptors. So I think, we just rub so much shit on our skin. You talked about these chemicals that are in the lotions and the creams, and they act like estrogen in the body, don't they? And so I think about, I'm not bloody perfect. I still don't use all amazing makeup. I use Saturée body cream, which is free from PUFAs and any sort of crap. And I think it's just about limiting it. Don't freak out and be like, oh my God, I have to get rid of everything. But I think, can you talk a little bit about, I think you did probably touch on that, hey, on the endocrine disruptors. It's just adding to that estrogen load, isn't it, really?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to look at, I'm going to pull something that I've been researching quite heavily, which is a flame retardant. Now, there's some studies there's a couple of studies that are quite interesting that kind of parallel with what you're putting on your skin or how you think. This particular flame retardant I'm looking at, although they've done some studies where they've fed it to rats or mice. They've rubbed it on their skin, or they've got it inhaled. And by far the most potent form of absorbing it was through the skin, because digestion, when it goes through first pass, the liver has some capacity to metabolize it and excrete it. Problem is that when we do that, we often hydroxylate some of these endocrine disruptors, which makes them more potent. So some endocrine disruptors aren't as bad as they seem, but when you actually put them through the process of the liver, they cause more problems. So this other flame retardant in China, for example, and it's the same flame retardant that was looked in studies within Melbourne, where they kind of found these very high levels of these flame retardants, is that they just went in cities that were quite far removed, in fact, very far removed away from these chemical producing structures. And they did forehead wipes And they found that everybody had very, very high levels of these not just flame retardants, other chemicals as well. You know, obviously combustion from engines and stuff like that. So you're being exposed to that kind of stuff every day. Now, to the extent that you're then putting, whether it's makeup on or kind of, you know, whether it's, you know, sun, you know, moisturizers or sun protectants, sun blockers, or everything, to the extent it has more of these chemicals in, and bearing in mind, it's a bit of a minefield because a lot of these chemicals can converge and cause problems as well. So the skin, I think, is a very pertinent issue, and it's just as relevant as what you're breathing in and what you're eating as well. So the skin can absorb lots and lots of chemicals, and again, the problem is that they tend to not go via the liver most of the time. They tend to go saturate into tissues, and you don't know how much that you actually end up absorbing. So I think it becomes very important, whether it's your cleaning products, whether it's your kind of skin products, being aware of what are the chemicals that are involved. And you can just take in some of those chemicals and go and look at some of the studies where they've studied that to see what the impact is. And again, many of them can act like estrogen, mimicking, you know, chemicals, which can cause problems. So the stuff that we not just eat, the stuff that we apply our skin can be highly estrogenic.
Perfect. And let's talk a little bit about strength training and why having more muscle can be beneficial.
But more muscle is just beneficial from multiple effects as you get older. I'm 52 now. I still train only a couple of times a week because I really enjoy walking in the hills. But you know, to have more muscle tissue makes you less frail. It makes you more robust to kind of, again, we talked about the idea of physical stress. If you're to fall over, perhaps you get hit by a car or something. Perhaps you fall when you're snowboarding or skiing or doing whatever you do. You know, having more muscle tissue is protective as an anti-frailty perspective. Even if you're not kind of above 50s and you're kind of, you know, in your 20s or 30s, being fitter helps you just deal with things more remote, you know, with all of the stresses that you're thrown at, whether it's emotional stress. It increases your metabolic rate, so you can consume more food if you like consuming more food. I love to train because I like to eat lots of different types of food, particularly cheese. So, you know, weight training can be very beneficial from promoting metabolism, for preventing you from having injury, for offsetting the effects of pollutants as well. Sweating has been shown to limit the amount of pollutants that you have because you end up sweating some out. And if you are in a high pollution area, particularly cities where they're sitting on your skin all the time, sweating can actually help to get rid of some of these endocrine disruptors that either sit on skin and also have actually gone into tissues. You can sweat them out.
Do you think there's anything else that we've missed? Any sort of the bigger, lower stress? Obviously, don't drink too much bloody booze or reduce the alcohol.
Yeah, booze is, you know, I mean, yeah, booze is a very it's a very salient factor. I think, you know, there's nothing wrong with drinking alcohol. It's to the extent that you can consume. You remember, most alcohols act like phytoestrogens. Beer, wine, for example. Since moving back to the UK, I tend to drink a bit more wine now because I see a lot more friends. But you know, I don't do it to excess. And the point is that when you are in a state where estrogen is all around you, we look to all these kind of polluted areas as an example where women might experience more menstrual disorders as well. It's like when you go and pile in with alcohol at the end of the day, and we know that ladies in the city, or certainly my experience in the past, were more prone to literally finishing up work whenever it was.
Just get
lunch, may have skipped lunch, right? Yeah, and then have a belly full of wine. Yeah. That capacity to cause dysfunction to the liver is phenomenal. And bearing in mind that excess alcohol also requires more thiamine. So if you're not getting enough nutrients in, your liver tends to be problematic. Your ability to use carbohydrate becomes restricted. Your capacity to overwhelm the liver with high amounts of estrogen, your capacity to have, you know, increased triglyceride and even non-alcoholic fatty liver disease can combine with fatty liver disease from consuming too much alcohol. There are kind of a couple of pathways that can increase these liver enzymes and promote dysfunction. So if you want to keep your body functioning at its best, whether it's to mitigate, you know, to stay at the weight that you want, to improve your liver function, to improve your energy, to maintain your sleep, to maintain the absence of symptoms during your menstrual cycles, what it should be, then, you know, avoiding an excess of alcohol. And I said, there's nothing wrong with consuming alcohol on a moderate basis, and it works works. There's nothing that should be avoided but if you have specific goals related to improving liver function and decreasing in weight, then it's just like any other thing. They are in excess of calories. They do limit the amount of thyming, or they do waste thyming with foods. So it can be quite problematic. So understanding that alcohol is going to impede your goals here, and also probably impede your hormones if you're not doing the right thing.
Yeah, don't cut it back is a good idea, I think. And if you've got a lot of healing to do and a lot of weight to lose, it can be beneficial to cut it out for a while. I think give your body a break. And then I think you'll just, when you drink again, you probably just won't drink that much, So, yeah.
If you do, take some aspirin.
Yeah. And niacinamide, it's good as well. And I think the
absolutely.
cocktail is really good too.
The what? Sorry?
Adrenal cocktail is a good one I have before bed if I've had a few drinks, is good. Do you think there's anything we've not covered? Anything else you want to
add? No, I think, again, just exploring the pathway of progesterone is a very important feature for a lot of women going through not just menopause, but menstrual cycle disorders. We talked about PMS as an example, anovulation, all of these factors, I think, do not discount the effects of getting adequate progesterone in, because it can be a complete game changer for most females. Even some guys, I've seen some progesterone doing some pretty interesting things in. So, don't discount that. If you're kind of just suffering from sleep disturbances, always think about perhaps the impact of progesterone. Always think about the impact of the energy regulation, getting enough nutrients in for that. Decrease the amount of serotonin and histamine that's being produced, and that's where also carrot salad can come back to kind of limiting those kind of neurotransmitters, because they are transmitters that keep you awake at night. So yeah, I think that's the main thing. And we can mitigate some things in our environment. Is trying to. But one of the most common findings within house dust are brominated flame retardants, because they're in furniture, they're in kitchenware, they're in kind of some fabrics and stuff. So understanding that, trying to perhaps get more natural fibers in the house that aren't treated with these flame retardants can be useful. It's not something that we can easily test for, and again, it's not something that we should be perhaps worrying about and becoming neurotic about. But if we kind of have a kind of approach to about what fibers we want in our house, what kind of things that we can manage, these are things that we can consider to help regulate hormones and ultimately decrease chemical stresses that we experience.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for that, Keith. It's always such a great pleasure when you come on, and I'll pop Keith's details in the show notes so you can go on and follow him. He puts out some great content. He's got some supplements that he sells as well that you can take a look at, and I am sure we will have you back on the podcast soon.